August 12, 1943. Marrick Strip Airfield, Papua New Guinea. The jungle evening hung thick and unforgiving over the remote American outpost carved into the steaming greenery of Papua New Guinea. The air tasted of metal, fuel, and distant storm. Engines coughed in tired rhythm. Wrenches clattered on concrete. The shadows of palm trees stretched long across the runway, trembling in the heat rising from oil-soaked dirt. The sun was dropping, but the temperature did not care. Sweat gathered on every brow, dripping like the slow leak of a faulty valve. At the center of this restless machinery stood Corporal Henry Wade, a quiet farm kid from Illinois with calloused hands and the kind of mind that saw patterns in chaos. He wiped his forehead with the back of an oily glove, blinking away the sting of sweat mixed with engine dust. Around him, the Marrick Strip hummed with the low, exhausted determination of an airfield that had seen more wounded aircraft than whole ones. B-25 Mitchells limped home each evening, as if returning from war with their heads bowed, wounded steel groaning under its own weight. If you love stories like this, real courage, real history, then don't just watch, become part of it. Subscribe now to WWII Frontline Legends and stand with the people who keep this history alive. Henry watched one of them now as it rolled into the hangar, smoke trailing faintly from a scorched nacelle. Its nose guns hung limp, jammed after yet another strafing run that failed to punch through the thick canopy, where Japanese troops hid with patient hostility. For weeks he had watched these planes stagger back for missions that should have been routine. The bomb patterns scattered wide because the targeting mechanisms shook loose under fire. Nose guns jammed when they were needed most. Armor plates rattled even under moderate recoil. Pilots cursed the humidity. Commanders blamed faulty intelligence. Mechanics tightened bolts that would shake loose again the next day. Henry, however, had been quietly studying something else. He had noticed the faint stress lines in the aircraft noses. He had traced them with a fingertip under the dim yellow bulbs of the night shift, memorizing the subtle groans and shivers of metal pushed beyond its intended limits. The structural nose of the B-25, he realized, had untapped potential. The frame could handle far more recoil than the aircraft engineers ever claimed. No one else had seen it, or maybe no one had dared to consider it. The thought had haunted him through sleepless nights. He had tried to ignore it, to stay within the official guidelines etched in the maintenance manuals stacked neatly in a corner of the hangar. But Henry had grown up fixing machinery on a farm where nothing was ever done by the book, because there was no book. You fixed the tractor with whatever you had. You shaped metal by instinct, and you trusted your hands. Now those same instincts told him something else. They told him the B-25's nose could become something more, something dangerous, something decisive. Yet the regulations were clear. No mechanic was authorized to modify fire control systems. No one was to install unapproved gun mounts. No one was to rewire triggers for synchronized forward fire. Every rule pointed in one direction. Do not interfere with systems that were not yours to redesign. Henry had repeated those rules to himself for weeks. But each time another damaged plane rolled in, each time another pilot staggered out covered in sweat and dust and frustration, the rules seemed less like guidance and more like chains. A particularly battered Mitchell arrived that afternoon, its bombardier compartment riddled with shrapnel. The crew chief swore under his breath as he inspected the damage. Henry climbed the ladder to the nose and crouched inside the cramped compartment. He ran his fingers along the metal, studying the dents and fractures as if they were clues in a puzzle only he could see. Behind him, the jungle wind sighed through the open doors of the hangar. Something in that sound settled Henry's thoughts. He knew what he had to do, and he knew it could cost him everything. He stepped back into the humid evening. The sky was turning from orange to deep crimson, the kind of color that clung to the horizon like a warning. A storm brewed somewhere beyond the tree line, and the distant thunder murmured like a drum that only Henry could hear. He glanced around. Most of the mechanics were packing up for the night. Commanders had retreated to briefings. The airfield grew quieter by the minute, its heartbeat slowing to an uneasy rest. Henry wiped his hands on his coveralls and took one last long look at the aircraft. The decision was made. Tonight he would break regulations. Tonight he would attempt something no one had allowed and no manual had ever mentioned. Tonight He would reach into the future of aerial warfare and drag something new into existence. And he would do it alone. Subscribe now to WWII Frontline Legends and stand with the people who keep this history alive. Every like, every share, every comment helps us honor those who lived these moments and shows your support for the hard work that goes into bringing these forgotten stories back to life. So hit that subscribe button, join our community, and tell us where you're watching from. Together, we're not just remembering history, we're keeping it alive. Darkness finally settled in, thick as tar. The moon rose behind a veil of drifting jungle smoke. Heat still radiated from the metal skins of aircraft long after the sun had vanished. Henry waited until the last footsteps faded and the hangar lights dimmed into scattered glows. Then he moved. He rolled his toolbox beside the selected B-25, its wheels whispering quietly on the concrete. He climbed the ladder into the nose compartment, lantern in one hand, the other gripping a list of ideas he had etched from memory. The document crinkled as he unfolded it. It contained sketches of gun mounts, estimates of recoil dispersion, calculations of frame tolerance. None of it existed in any approved blueprint. He set the lantern down. The shadows flickered over the empty bombardier seat. Henry exhaled slowly. Then he removed the seat entirely, freeing space for the modification he had envisioned. The compartment suddenly felt larger, as if the aircraft exhaled with him. He opened a crate of spare gun mounts. They were not designed for the nose frame, but Henry knew metal better than he knew most people. He measured distances, tilted mounts, tapped metal plates with the back of a wrench, listening for sonic clues in the ringing. The jungle outside pulsed with the chirping of insects. Each chirp felt like a ticking clock. Henry worked quickly. He welded extra mounts using borrowed Italian steel from a downed Japanese aircraft. Sparks danced across the nose interior, lighting the compartment in brief stabs of white and orange. Sweat rolled down Henry's temples as he shaped the mounts into place. The smell of molten metal filled the narrow space. His hands shook from the intensity of the task, not from fear, but from the knowledge that every movement carried the weight of consequence. He rewired the fire control relay next. The pilot's yoke had never been intended to fire 8 forward guns simultaneously. But Henry understood the circuitry well enough to bypass the restrictions. He connected wires with a strange mixture of delicacy and boldness. Copper strands intertwined like the threads of fate. Unapproved, unauthorized, unmistakably effective. The night deepened. The air thickened. Henry felt the pressure of secrecy building around him like a coiled spring. He tested the mounts again. They held. He examined the trigger relay. The connection felt solid. He tightened the last bolt. Then he sat back on the floor of the compartment, chest rising and falling as he stared at what he had created. A new kind of B-25, a flying buzzsaw, a machine that could unleash a storm of fire no enemy would expect. But the night had not finished with him yet. Tomorrow, pilots would discover the truth. Tomorrow, someone would notice what he had done. Tomorrow, the war itself might shift in a way no one could predict. August 13th, 1943. Merrick Strip Airfield, Papua New Guinea. Early morning. Dawn crept slowly over the jungle canopy, casting pale light through drifting fog that curled around palm trunks like ghostly fingers. The airfield shook itself awake with the familiar cough of engines warming, the metallic clatter of tools, and the murmured exhaustion of men who had slept little. The ground shimmered with early heat, and the scent of oil mixed with damp earth created a heavy blanket across the runway. Inside the hangar, Corporal Henry Wade stood beside the modified B-25. The aircraft seemed to breathe differently now, as if aware that its body had been altered in ways the brass would not approve and the manuals would never acknowledge. Henry wiped his hand again, though the grease never fully left. He had spent nearly the entire night shaping the machine into something new, something powerful, something forbidden. The welds still held warmth. The wires still carried tension. The mounts felt alive under his fingertips. As the morning light brightened, shadows shifted across the hangar floor. Henry took a step back to look at the transformation. 8 forward gun mounts waited in perfect alignment. The rewired trigger relay, tucked carefully along the yoke path, looked deceptively simple. The empty bombardier space gave the aircraft a new, predatory face. But Henry knew what this meant. Someone would notice. Someone would ask questions. And the answers would never be safe. He heard footsteps, not the casual shuffle of mechanics, but the firm stride of a man who belonged in the air more than on the ground. Captain Rafe Dakota Harmon entered the hangar, flight jacket unzipped, eyes sharp despite the fatigue of endless missions. His boots echoed in steady rhythm as he approached the B-25. Henry stiffened, wiping his gloves again out of instinct. Dakota paused at the nose of the aircraft. For a long moment he simply stared. Henry braced himself. The captain inspected the stripped bombardier compartment. His fingers traced the new mounts, the welds that glistened faintly, the wiring that no regulation permitted. Then he stepped back slowly. Henry expected anger. He expected a reprimand so severe it would echo across the entire airfield. But instead, Dakota inhaled sharply, and something colder settled behind his eyes. It was not frustration. It was fear, because Dakota knew something Henry did not. Something that made this illegal upgrade more than a gamble. Something that turned this violation into a lifeline. 2 hours earlier, Dakota had been in a tense midnight briefing. A scout pilot from the 8th Photographic Squadron had stumbled into camp after crash landing in the Northern Valley. His aircraft had bullet scars across the fuselage and jungle branches lodged in the wheel wells. Before medics took him away, he whispered to Dakota one impossible phrase. He claimed he had seen a Japanese column moving through the valley. Not a patrol, not a small force. A column more than a mile long, packed with infantry, supply carriers, and support units. More than 3,000 soldiers. A force that intelligence insisted could not exist. A force heading straight toward Allied positions. Yet the scout had no photographs, no proof, only a terrified memory. Dakota had left the briefing shaken, searching for answers in a sky still dark. When he entered the hangar that morning and saw Henry's illegal creation, something in the captain's chest tightened. Henry had built a weapon capable of ripping through dense infantry with terrifying efficiency. But what disturbed Dakota most was that Henry should not have known anything about the scout's report. The information had been classified. Just a handful of commanders were aware. And yet Henry had built a solution for a threat he should not have known existed. The air around them felt heavier. Dakota finally spoke, but only in the soft voice of a man trying to calculate fate. The narrator described his reaction with quiet finality. Dakota was not angry because he recognized what this aircraft had become. He feared it because he sensed the truth. This modification matched too perfectly with the impossible threat marching toward them. Someone had spoken to Henry, or someone had wanted Henry to act. And the implications of that were far more dangerous than the modification itself. Dakota circled the aircraft again, assessing structural tension with a practiced eye. He imagined the recoil of 8 50 caliber guns firing in perfect synchronization. The frame should buckle. The nose should tear from the aircraft. Yet Henry's welds held firm. The mounts looked secure enough to withstand the violence of extreme strafing runs. It was an engineering breakthrough that should have taken months, not one moonlit night. The airfield noise faded under the weight of this discovery. Henry stood still, waiting. Dakota's silence lasted long enough to make the morning feel even colder. Finally, the captain placed one hand on the nose of the B-25, as if greeting a new creature. The narrator observed the shift. Dakota saw potential in the modification, potential and danger. But he also saw urgency. He knew there was no time for reports, no time for approvals, no time for debate. If the scout pilot story was true, the Japanese column would reach the edge of the valley within 48 hours. Once they reached the forward ridge, the airfields at Merrick Strip, WWII, and Papandetta would be threatened. Thousands of American personnel, supplies, aircraft, and artillery would be exposed. Dakota stepped back and turned to Henry with a measured, uneasy calm. He would take this aircraft up for a test. He had no choice. The war was changing shape, and this unauthorized weapon might be the only tool capable of cutting through the shifting darkness. As Dakota issued a quiet order to prep the aircraft for immediate engine checks, Henry felt a tremor of uncertainty. He had imagined the pilot's anger. He had imagined reprimands. But he had not imagined fear. He had not imagined secrecy. And he had not imagined that the modification would match a hidden threat so precisely. In the next moments, the hangar filled with the whine of turbines starting up. Mechanics looked on in confusion, unsure why the test was happening without the usual paperwork. Dakota climbed into the cockpit, hands steady but eyes clouded with knowledge far heavier than any mechanic's tools could touch. Henry stood below, heart pounding. The morning fog swirled around the aircraft as engines roared to life. The narrator marked the tension rising like pressure in a lock boiler. The test flight would begin, and the consequences of what Henry had done would soon reveal themselves in ways that neither he nor Dakota could foresee. August 14, 1943. North of WWII, Papua New Guinea. Dawn. Dawn crept in slowly over the tangled canopy, its pale glow clinging to the jungle like a thin veil. Morning fog curled in heavy ribbons between the treetops, and the air carried the dense smell of wet earth and burning humidity. Engines throbbed across Merrick Strip, echoing against the distant hills. At the center of the runway, the modified B-25 waited with an animalistic growl. Its 8 forward barrels pointed toward the horizon, as if sensing what lay ahead. Captain Rafe, Dakota. Harmon climbed into the cockpit with a quiet heaviness, aware that this test flight was more than a test. Corporal Henry Wade stood below, hands resting against his legs, watching with a mixture of hope and dread. The aircraft he had created in secret now faced the sky, and whatever truth hid within it. The engines roared. Wheels left the ground. The B-25 lifted, climbing into a blanket of thick fog that blotted out the world below. Dakota flew low, skimming the treetops, listening to the hum of rewired circuits and the tension of unapproved modifications threaded through the metal beneath him. The aircraft felt different, heavier in the nose, tighter in the frame, more responsive in its climb. The legal welds held. The mounts resisted vibration. The nose moved as one solid beast. Miles of jungle passed beneath him in a blur of deep green shadows. Then the land parted into a narrow valley. Fog thinned, and what waited below shattered every expectation. A Japanese column stretched through the valley like a steel spine. It moved in a silent tide of bodies and equipment. Infantry units marched with ruthless rhythm. Pack animals trudged under crates of ammunition. Supply carts creaked through mud. Forward elements disappeared into thick brush. Smoke from cooking fires drifted upward in faint, trembling strands. The formation was massive, larger than any unit intelligence believed possible in the region. More than 3,000 soldiers moved with purpose toward the ridges that guarded Allied airfields. Dakota's breath tightened in his chest. The scout pilot's impossible report was true. A force built to overwhelm the region had been hidden in plain sight. Dakota descended sharply. Leaves brushed the belly of the plane. The jungle surged upward as he leveled the aircraft at treetop height. The B-25 thundered through the valley, engines howling, the tree line exploding outward in spirals of mist. The forward gun mounts aligned perfectly. Dakota pulled the trigger. 8.50 caliber guns erupted in perfect unison, unleashing a concentrated storm of fire, so violent that the valley itself seemed to recoil. Nearly 5,000 rounds tore through the jungle in seconds. Trees splintered. Earth detonated in violent plumes. Japanese troops scattered with no direction, swallowed by the sudden thunder of metal and flame. Supply lines ruptured. Communications posts vanished. Hundreds fell before they realized what was happening. The aircraft screamed through the column, a streak of fire and steel. Dakota swung the nose to re-engage. Every pass carved deeper into the formation until the once organized line became a broken trail of smoke, debris, and shattered intent. The guns finally fell silent, empty. The aircraft leveled out, gliding over a valley transformed into a scorched graveyard. Dakota pulled back slowly on the yoke, his hands trembling, the weight of what had happened settling over him in stunned waves. 15 minutes. 3,000 soldiers. A single unauthorized idea. The flight back to Merrick Strip unfolded under a curtain of thickening clouds. The engines hummed a steady, almost mournful tone. Dakota barely registered the landscape passing under him. The destruction haunted his thoughts. Henry's illegal creation had not just worked. It had worked with terrifying, undeniable efficiency. The aircraft touched down. The wheels hissed against the runway. The engines powered down in a slow, echoing sigh. Smoke curled upward from the overheated barrels, drifting into the sky like ghosts rising from the valley. Dakota climbed out of the cockpit. Henry waited, breath frozen, searching the pilot's face for any sign of what had happened. But before either man could speak, military police closed in. They moved quickly, surrounding Henry with rigid precision. Orders had been filed. Protocols had been broken. Someone had exposed the modification before the plane had even returned. But before the cuffs tightened, a high-ranking intelligence officer stepped forward, a sealed dossier under his arm. He ordered the MPs to stand down and handed Dakota the folder. Inside were photographs already developed from reconnaissance aircraft dispatched minutes after the strike. They revealed something far more unsettling than the destroyed column. The remnants of a massive Japanese base hidden deep within the jungle. A base no Allied intelligence report had ever acknowledged. The column had not been marching toward the airfields. It had been retreating from something larger. Henry's illegal upgrade had not only stopped an unseen threat, it had exposed one. As Dakota looked over at Henry, still silent, still surrounded, one chilling reality pressed down on them both. Some parts of war are buried because they reveal too much. What happened to Henry Wade after that morning never appeared in any declassified archive. His story vanished as quietly as it began. Please share, like, comment, and subscribe to get more of this. Your support keeps these forgotten heroes alive and helps WWII Frontline Legends bring you more powerful stories from the past. Tell us where you're watching from. I read every single comment.